Chapter 8 is about social stratification. What does that mean? Social stratification means a society that has layers in it, or strata, or layer is a stratum, plural is strata. So what are these layers, and how are they constituted? Well, sociologists say that these layers represent social classes. The top layers are upper classes, the middle layers are middle classes, and the lower layers are lower classes of people. Class is the primary tool that sociologists use. Anthropologists use the concept of culture to talk about different cultures and their characteristics that they hold in common and different. But social class is the primary tool of the sociologist that can be applied to any society. Our class system in our country has a number of classes. You can designate as many classes as you want simply by carving up your layers more and more finely. Usually it's dependent upon how much research you can do, and in terms of academics that do the research, it depends on how many graduate students they've got to establish the number of social classes that they can afford to study. Most folks think of the class structure as 4 or 5 class scale, or maybe a 6 class scale. In England, for example, the United Kingdom, there's an upper class usually identified, a middle class that's identified, a working class that has jobs and works for a living, and then they hesitate to talk about a lower class, and they frequently include them in the working class. Here in the United States, we tend to say that there's an upper class, a middle class, and then a working class that has a job and an income, and then a lower class that may be jobless and out on the street. The class system, as it's identified, as I said, depends upon how you do your research and how you organize your research. But that there is a class structure in the United States is pretty clear. 1% of the population controls about 35% of the assets of the social wealth in the country. That's 1% and 30%. There are a lot of rich folks who have an awful lot of money. Poor people in the United States, though, can have a pretty hard row to hoe. They have problems of access to medical care. They have problems of access to food. They have problems of access to schooling. And our class system, somewhat like that of European countries and Canada, it has problems, and they're very difficult to solve. The Soviet Union and China both tried to solve the problem by eliminating social classes. Neither one was successful. Classes still emerged. For example, during the Stalin years, back in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, and 60s, and 70s in the Soviet Union, there were 4 clear-cut classes. One very rich class were what were called the apparatchiks, people who ran the party apparatus and controlled the power of the country and through the government ministries. And then there were the academics and professionals and doctors who had power. And then below them there were people who worked for a living in factories and on the street, holding jobs. And then there were folks who lived in the countryside and were farmers. The farmers were desperately poor in Russia, as they are in China, still are today. So all countries, including those countries that try to do away with the class structure, do have one. And the question is why? Why do they have a class structure? Why can't there be full equality? Well, there's a thesis in your book put forward by 2 people called Davis, with names Davis and Moore. And the Davis-Moore thesis is that the class structures make sense. That's why they exist all over the world. that some people have more to offer society than others, and they claim that classes are absolutely necessary to the structure of society, and that lousy jobs have to receive lousy pay. Good jobs ought to get good pay. Jobs that are worth a lot to society ought to have lots of money attached to them, and those jobs that aren't worth much to society ought to have less money and less income. So therefore, classes make sense. But there are people who argue, many people who argue, including Karl Marx and Marxists generally, who argue that there are a lot of reasons for social classes that are not expressed in the Davis-Moore thesis. For example, they say some people are simply born with money. They don't earn it. And there are other people who make a heck of a lot of money, but their contribution to society may not be particularly enriching. You can think of the extraordinary income of television stars, movie stars, or the extraordinary income of actors and actresses. They make a lot of money, and whether or not they contribute to society in a worthy way, worth at least their income, is questioned by a lot of people. Marx said that that class conflict is inevitable. It will happen until there is full equality, and that full equality can't be generated until we find a way of having everybody perform useful work, and that useful work has equal value. Now, does that mean that the problem of social class is inevitable and must continue forever? Well, the Marxists say no. They say that there is such a thing as progress, and that the social distance between the upper classes and the lower classes may shrink. And in some ways, that is borne out in the American experience in that we have a big, fat middle class, a huge middle class, a small upper class, and a relatively small lower class. But there still is a great deal of social distance. People who are chief executives in major corporations can make almost $1 billion a year. Some movie stars make $400 or $500 million a year. So it's possible for some folks to be extraordinarily rich. But the point is that some progress has been made in allowing larger numbers of people to share in the wealth in a very, very large middle class. And that seems to be the trend in European countries and in Japan as well. So, can people move up? Can they be mobile? Is there such a thing as social mobility? Well, social mobility, if you read your text, is substantially a myth. It is very, very hard to achieve. It's hard to move up into the upper classes if that's where you want to be headed. And many of the factors have to do with income, they have to do with wealth, they have to do with power. Max Weber said that all of those factors have to be weighed in terms of the development of the class structure. Some of the factors that have to do with how you can get ahead have to do with schooling. So they're one of the goals of most progressives in the United States is to make educational access easier and less expensive so that more people can get more schooling. But the factors of ancestry, of race, and gender still are very, very powerful. So some folks say that social mobility is difficult, very, very difficult, and that most of it is mythological rather than a real condition. Those are most of the issues that are described in that chapter. But please remember that the primary tool of sociologists is this question of social class, and it will show up repeatedly in succeeding chapters in the text. I hope you found this interesting again, and I look forward to a discussion of this topic with you.